Eleanor Bishop priced her dead husband's car at $50, the same price she put on his fishing tackle, the same price as the rusted lawnmower out back. A life's work, tagged like junk on a paper string. And she didn't cry when she wrote the number. She'd run out of crying back in March. Then, the estate man came. Chick Lorwin, sharp shoes on the oil-stained floor. He walked her husband's garage like he owned it already. "This heap? I'd be doing you a favor hauling it off, sweetheart." He said it in front of 11 neighbors. And every single one of them nodded. 2 insults in one breath. The widow waved off like a fool. The dead man's masterpiece, called a heap. Then a gray-haired man in a dusty Ford eased off the county road. He lifted the tarp. He put one hand on the fender. And that hand would not stop shaking. If you believe respect is earned in silence, this story is for you. Before we go on, do something for me. Subscribe to the channel. And in the comments, tell me the town you're watching from tonight. I want to see how far the larkspur travels, because this story is about a car that vanished off the face of the earth for 20 years. And it was hiding in plain sight the whole time. Now let me start at the beginning. Eleanor Bishop married a quiet man in the fall of 1953. Everybody called her Nell. Everybody called him Ray. And in Marne Falls, Michigan, that was about all anybody needed to know about a person. Your first name, and whether you were quiet. Ray was quiet. That was the word people used for him, and they used it kindly. He kept his voice low and his hands busy. He worked the axle plant out on the Ferris Road for 31 years, and in all that time he was late exactly twice, both for funerals. He brought his lunch in a black tin pail. He never raised his voice at her, not once in 41 years, and Nell would tell you that like it was a small thing. It was not a small thing. She just didn't know how rare it was, because she'd never had to live with the other kind. He died that past February, the cold, quiet part of the winter, when the snow stops falling and just sits there gray on the ground for weeks. His heart, the doctor said. It happened in the night, in his chair, with the radio still on low. Nell woke up, and the house was too still, and she knew before she got to the doorway. She'd been married to the man's breathing for 4 decades. She knew the shape of the silence when it stopped. The axle plant sent a card, 26 signatures, some of them men Ray had trained. And they sent a clock, a mantle clock, brass-colored, with a little brass plate that said for 31 years of service. It sat on her mantle now, and it ticked, and some nights that ticking was the loudest thing in the house. She thought about stopping it. She never did. It was the last thing anybody gave him for the work of his hands, and it felt like a sin to let it wind down. Now it was autumn. October, the maples along Cutler Street had gone to rust and gold, and the mornings had that bite that told you the real cold was coming back. Nell was 61 years old, and she was alone in a house that had held 2 people for a very long time. She had buried a lot of things that winter besides Ray. She'd been a school cafeteria cook for 22 years, over at Marne Falls Consolidated, and she'd retired the spring before he passed. So she didn't even have the work anymore. She didn't have the 6 o'clock alarm, the big steaming kettles, the noise of 300 children. She had the house. She had the clock. And she had the garage, which she had not opened since the day he died. That garage sat off the side of the house, low and long, with a wide plank door that Ray had hung himself. And along the whole south wall of it, every single spring for 41 years, Ray had planted larkspurs. Tall, blue-purple spikes of them, thick as a hedge by July. Nell used to ask him why. Why larkspurs? Why there? Why against the garage wall, where the exhaust and the oil would get at them? And Ray would just look at the flowers, and look at her, and say, "No reason." That was all. No reason worth saying. And he'd go back inside to his cars. His foolishness. That was what she called it, the garage and everything in it. She said it with a smile, mostly a wife's smile. The kind that forgives a thing it doesn't understand. Because Nell never understood the garage. She understood the paycheck. The paycheck raised no children, they were never given any, but it kept the house, kept the roof sound. Kept them in coffee and shoes and a used Buick every 8 or 10 years. That was Ray's real work, to her mind. The plant, the pail, the 31 years. The garage was where he went after. Where he'd disappear on a Saturday and she'd hear the ping of a hammer on metal, slow and patient, hour after hour. She never went out there. It wasn't that he kept her out. He'd have welcomed her. She just never saw the point. It was his foolishness, and a man was entitled to some foolishness, and hers was that she read the same 3 romance novels over and cried at the radio dramas. Everybody got one thing that made no sense. His was the cars. He'd built cars once, before her. She knew that much. Before they married, when he was a young man, Ray had done something with automobiles, out west or down south, somewhere with more sun than Michigan. He gave it all up the year they wed. Just stopped. Came home to Marne Falls, took the axle plant job, and never went back to whatever it was. She never asked why. That was the truth of it, and she was a little ashamed of it now, sitting alone in the fall. She never once asked her husband why he quit the thing he'd done before her. She was just glad he'd stopped. Glad he was home nights. Glad he was hers and not the road's. Now the letter came, and the letter changed everything. It was from Ferris County Savings and Loan. It came on a Tuesday, in a stiff envelope with the bank's name up in the corner in blue ink. Nell almost didn't open it, the way she almost didn't open a lot of mail those days. But something about the weight of it made her sit down at the kitchen table first. And she was glad she was sitting. Ray had taken a loan against the house. Years back. She'd known about it, dimly. There'd been a bad winter with the furnace, and a worse one with his mother's care before the old woman passed. And Ray had handled the money the way Ray handled everything. Quietly, without troubling her. She'd signed a paper once at the bank and not read it, because Ray was standing beside her, and Ray reading a thing was as good as her reading it. Better, but Ray was gone. And the payments had gone with him. Nell had been living on his pension and the little bit of hers, and she had not understood, truly understood, that the house payment came out of a different pocket than the light bill. She'd missed it in March, in the fog of the burying. And April. And on, each month a little further under, until the letter came and put the number in front of her in blue ink. $2,760 in arrears. And below that, in a colder sentence, the property to be foreclosed and sold if the sum was not paid in full by the last Friday in October. Nell read it 3 times. Then she set it flat on the table and put both her hands over it, palms down, like you'd hold down a thing that might blow away. $2,760. She did not have it. She did not have a tenth of it in the bank. She had the pension, which came monthly and was already spoken for. And she had the house itself, which was the very thing on the block. And she had a garage full of a dead man's foolishness. The last Friday in October. She counted it out on the calendar that hung by the icebox, the free one from Detmer's Diner with a covered bridge on it. 18 days. She had 18 days to find $2,760, or she would lose the house where she had been a wife for 41 years, the house with the larkspurs on the garage wall. She did not cry. She'd told you already, she'd run out of that in March. She sat at the table until the light went long and orange through the west window. And then she got up and made herself a cup of tea she didn't drink, and she thought about what a person sells when a person has nothing left to sell but a life. You sell the life. That's the answer. There's no gentle way around it. You put a paper string on everything you and a good man built for 41 years, and you write a number on each string, and you open the doors and let strangers walk through and pick it over. A yard sale. An estate sale, the fancy people called it. But in Marne Falls it was a yard sale. And everybody would know exactly what it meant. The Bishop widows selling out. The Bishop widows under. She decided on it that night, at the kitchen table, dry-eyed. Everything would go. The good furniture, the second-best furniture, the dishes, the linens, Ray's tools, Ray's tackle, Ray's mower, and yes, she made herself think it all the way through, the thing under the tarp in the garage. All of it. Everything must go, because that was the phrase, wasn't it? Everything must go. If it added up to enough, she kept the house. If it didn't, she lost the house and the money both, and she'd cross that when she came to it. The next morning she made herself do the hardest part first. She opened the garage. She hadn't been inside since February. The wide plank door stuck at the bottom the way it always had, and she had to lift and drag it, and a wedge of cold October light fell across the floor and lit up the dust. Lord, the dust. 8 months of it, thick and gray and undisturbed, lying over everything like the first thin snow of the year. It hung in the light where she'd stirred it. It smelled like cold metal and old motor oil, and underneath, faintly, like him. Like Ray. That smell nearly took her knees. She stood in the doorway and breathed it and let it pass. There was the workbench along the back wall. His tools hung on a pegboard in the outlines he'd painted for each one, so a wrench had a wrench-shaped shadow to go home to. There was the tackle box. The mower, coffee cans of bolts and washers sorted by size, because that was Ray, a man who sorted washers. And in the middle of the floor, low and long, a shape under a canvas tarp. She'd forgotten how big it was. That surprised her. In her memory it was smaller, the way things are in memory. But it filled the middle of the garage, a long low hump of gray canvas gone stiff and pale with dust. And the tarp draped down over wheels she knew without looking were flat, tires perished to gray rubber after all these years up on nothing. She lifted one corner, just one corner, at the front. Chrome, gone to freckled rust. That was what she saw. A bumper or a grill, she couldn't tell, the metal beaded over with little red-brown spots like a disease. She let the corner fall. Whatever it was under there, it was the last and biggest piece of his foolishness, and it had sat in this garage for 20 years going quietly to rust, while Ray drove the Buick to the plant every morning like a sensible man. He'd built it or bought it before her, she'd never been clear which, and he'd tarped it the year they married, and, so far as she knew, never touched it again. 20 years under canvas. 20 years of dust. She got her box of paper tags and her pencil, and she started to price the life. The tackle box was easy. Ray hadn't fished in years, and it was a good box, and she wrote $2 and hung the string on the handle. The mower, $5 if it even ran, and she wasn't sure it did. The tools were harder, because the tools were his hands in a way, the pegboard with the painted shadows, but she made herself do it. $1 for the good hammer, 50 cents for a wrench. She priced the whole pegboard for $11 and hated herself doing it, and did it anyway, because the bank did not care about painted shadows. Then she came to the car. She stood in front of the tarp for a long time, longer than she'd stood anywhere that morning. She didn't lift it again. She didn't need to. She knew what was under there. A heap. An old project, rusted and flat and dead, that Ray had loved for reasons he'd taken to the ground with him. Nobody in Marne Falls wanted an old rusted-out roadster with perished tires. She knew that much about cars. You wanted a car that ran. This one hadn't run since Eisenhower. But she couldn't leave it off the tags. Everything must go. So she thought about the number. And the number was a strange thing, because the number wasn't really about money. If it were about money, she'd have priced it at $500 and let it sit unsold and lost the house. No, the number was about what she could bear. What she could stand to see a stranger hand her across the tailgate for the thing her husband had loved most in the world after her. And she wasn't even sure it came after her. If she was honest, some Saturdays, $50. She wrote it on the tag. 50, the number she could bear. The number that meant gone, and paid for, and done. Not so high that it insulted her by pretending the heap was worth something, not so low it was a joke. $50, the same as she might have asked for a good icebox. She tied the string to the tarp itself, up near the front where a buyer's eye would find it, and she stepped back, and her hand was steady the whole time. Grief had made her hand steady. That was one thing nobody warned you about. After a certain amount of it, you stop shaking. You just do the next thing. She saved the newspaper ads and told a few people at church, and word did the rest, because word always does in a town like Marne Falls. Estate sale at the Bishop place. Saturday. Everything must go. By Friday night, the whole street knew, and by Saturday morning, before the dew was even off the grass, they came. 11 of them, in that first hour. She counted, the way you count a room you're nervous in, the Halloran sisters, who came to every sale in the county and bought nothing. Young Pete Mackey and his wife, furnishing a first house. Old Wendell Pruitt, 80 if he was a day, one of the diner crowd, leaning on his cane. The Turskys from 2 doors down, a couple of faces she half knew, and a couple she didn't. They moved through her front room and her yard, lifting the good dishes to the light, turning over the lamps, and Nell stood by the card table where she'd set the cash box and made change and tried to keep her face pleasant. They bought the small things. The dishes went. The linens. Pete Mackey's wife took the good Davenport for $8, and Nell watched 2 men she'd fed as schoolboys carry her sofa down the porch steps and load it in a truck, and she kept her face pleasant. It came to a little over $40 in the first hour. 40 out of 2,760. She did the arithmetic without meaning to, and made herself stop. And the whole time, nobody went in the garage. They saw the open door. A few glanced in. But there was something about it, the dust, the dark, the low shape under the tarp, that turned people back to the sunlit yard where the friendly things were. It was Ray's place, still, and even strangers felt it a little. Then the Tursky boy went in. He was maybe 10, bored, poking at things while his mother haggled over a lamp. Nell saw him drift through the plank door into the dark, and she nearly called him back, and then didn't. He circled the tarped car once. He towed a flat tire. And he called out, in that flat, cruel honesty children have, loud enough for the yard to hear, "Ma, there's just a junk pile in here." A junk pile. A few people laughed, not unkindly, the way you laugh at a child. Nell felt it land somewhere under her ribs, but she kept her face pleasant, because the boy wasn't wrong, was he? That was the trouble. By every plain measure a plain person could see, the boy was right. It was a junk pile. $50 of junk with a paper string on it. But then old Wendell Pruitt went in after the boy. Nell almost didn't notice. She was making change for the Halloran sisters, who'd finally bought a single teacup for a nickel. But out of the side of her eye she saw the old man leave the yard and go to the garage, slow on his cane, and duck in under the low door. And she thought nothing of it. Wendell had known Ray. The whole diner crowd had known Ray. An old man wanting a last look at a dead friend's garage. There was nothing in that. What happened next she only half saw, and didn't understand for a long time after. Wendell Pruitt stood over the tarp. Then he bent, with difficulty, an old man's careful bend, and he took the corner of the canvas, not the front corner where her price tag hung, but the side, back by where a door would be. And he lifted it. Just lifted it, a foot or two, and looked underneath. And the old man's face changed. She saw it even from the yard, even across the distance, even through the doorway's shadow. Wendell Pruitt went gray. The blood went out of his face the way it goes out of a man's face when he gets terrible news standing up. He held the tarp a moment longer. Then he let it down, gently, the way you'd let down a blanket over somebody sleeping, and he straightened up, and he stood there a second with his hand pressed flat on the canvas. And then he turned and walked out of that garage and past the card table and past Nell without a word, without meeting her eye, out to the street and down the sidewalk toward town, faster than an 80-year-old man on a cane had any business walking. Nell watched him go. "Wendell?" she called after him. He didn't turn. He just lifted one hand, a sort of wave, a sort of no, and kept going. Odd, she thought. She thought it was grief. She thought the old man had gone in to say goodbye to Ray's place and couldn't bear it, the way she could barely bear it herself. That was the whole of what she made of it. Old men and their feelings. She turned back to the cash box because Pete Mackey wanted to talk about the mower. She had no idea she'd just watched a man recognize a ghost. It was near 11 when Chick Lorwin came. She'd heard of him. Everybody had. Chick Lorwin ran an estate business out of Ferris City, 40 minutes off, and he had a reputation that arrived before his car did. He bought whole houses of a dead person's things, the fancier kind of estate, and he flipped them at his shop on the highway with the prices tripled. He wore a sport coat to a yard sale. That told you the man. He wore a checked sport coat and driving gloves and shoes with a shine on them, and he drove a long, clean Oldsmobile that he parked crooked across 2 spots in front of her house, like the street was his. He came up the walk smiling. That was the thing about Chick Lorwin, he smiled the whole time. "Mrs. Bishop," he put out a hand. "Terrible sorry for your loss." Terrible. Ray was a fine man, everybody says so. He'd never met Ray in his life. "I'm Chick Lorwin, I do estates. I wonder if we might talk turkey." And then he did the cruelest, smoothest thing, and he did it in front of all of them. Because by now there were maybe a dozen people in the yard and he wanted an audience. He wanted witnesses to a bargain, so the bargain would look like a favor. He walked her wholesale in 10 minutes, out loud, running everything down as he went. Not to be mean, he'd have said. Just business. "This lamp's got a crack. See it? That's a $1 item, not a 3. These chairs, honey, nobody wants Brown anymore. Brown's dead." He worked the numbers down, item by item, and every time he named a fault, the neighbors leaned in a little, because they were buyers too, and a man in a sport coat telling them a thing was worthless made them feel smart for not wanting it. And then he came to the garage. He stood in the plank doorway with his hands in his coat pockets, and he looked at the tarp, and he laughed. Out loud. A short, easy laugh. "Oh boy," he said. "What have we got here?" He stepped in, and he flipped the whole tarp back off the front of the car with one careless yank of his gloved hand, so a cloud of dust rolled up gold in the doorway light, and the neighbors crowded in behind to see. Nell saw it then, in daylight, the front of it, for the first time in 20 years. A long, low nose, silver once, gone dull and freckled with rust, a grill of thin vertical bars, some of them bent, round headlamps sunk in rusted rings. It looked like exactly what the Tursky boy had said. A junk pile. An old car, low to the ground, sitting on 4 flat perished tires, its paint gone to chalk and rust, its chrome gone to disease. Chick Lorwin looked at it and shook his head, still smiling, and he delivered the guillotine. He turned so the whole doorway of neighbors could hear him, and he said it loud. "This heap? Lady, I'd be doing you a favor hauling it off." A couple of people chuckled. He warmed to it. He kicked one flat tire with the toe of his shined shoe. "I'll tell you what, I'll take the whole garage off your hands. The car, the bench, all them tools, the tackle, the works. Clean it right out for you so you don't have to look at it. He named his number like he was doing charity. $40. For all of it, whole garage. And I'll sweep up after. $40. For all of it. For the car she'd priced alone at $50, and every tool with a painted shadow, and Ray's tackle and his workbench, and 20 years of a man's Saturdays. $40. And he'd sweep up after. And then he said the thing that set her jaw. He looked around the garage, at the pegboard, at the coffee cans of sorted washers, at the long-dead car, and he said, loud, grinning, to the whole crowd of her neighbors, whoever your husband was, he sure liked hoarding scrap. They nodded. That was the part Nell would carry. Not Lorwin. Lorwin was a stranger, a salesman. You expected a snake to hiss. It was her neighbors. The people she'd fed, the people she'd sat beside in church, the Turskys and the Hallorans and Pete Mackey, she watched them nod. Little nods. Sure, old Ray and his scrap. A quiet man with a garage full of nothing. It was easier to nod. It was easier to agree with the man in the sport coat that the dead man had been a bit of a fool. Because then the $40 looked fair, and everyone could go home feeling they'd seen a widow done a favor. Nell stood by her card table. She had $2,720 still to find, and 11 days now to find it, and a man in driving gloves was offering her 40 of it cash. Right now, no more strangers in her yard, no more of this. $40 would have been the sensible thing. Take it. Be done. That is what a woman with a foreclosure notice on her icebox is supposed to do. She looked at Chick Lorwin, smiling in her husband's garage. She looked at the flat dead car he'd called a heap. She looked at the pegboard where every tool had a painted shadow to come home to, because Ray was a man who could not stand to see a thing without its proper place. And something in her set. Quiet, like the rest of her. But set. No thank you, Nell said. Lorwin's smile didn't move, but his eyes did. Now, Mrs. Bishop? No, thank you, Missa Lorwin. She said it plain and even, the voice she'd used on 300 children for 22 years, the voice that did not argue and did not raise itself and could not be moved. The car's not for sale to you, not for $40, not for any dollars. He blinked. He looked at the neighbors, sharing it with them. Can you believe this woman? It's got a $50 tag on it. Right there. You priced it yourself. I did. She didn't explain. She wasn't going to stand in her husband's garage and explain to this man that 50 was the number she could bear from someone, but there was no number she could bear from him, that the difference wasn't the money. The difference was that he'd stood over Ray's life's work and called the man a hoarder of scrap, and she'd be foreclosed and living in her sister's spare room in Saginaw before she'd hand Ray over to be flipped on a highway lot by a man who laughed at him. She just said, "It's not for sale to you." Chick Lorwin's smile finally curdled. He pulled the tarp back up over the front of the car. Rough, careless, suit yourself, he said. You'll be calling me by Wednesday, sweetheart, when reality sets in. He named the last word like a slap. And he walked out through the neighbors, who parted for him, and he got in his long, clean Oldsmobile and pulled away from the curb hard enough to chirp the tire. The yard was quiet a moment. Then the Halloran sisters found something to say about the weather, and the sale started up again, thin now, the good energy gone out of it. People bought a few more small things. It came to $60-some by noon. 60 out of 2,760. That afternoon, in a lull, Nell did a thing she'd been putting off. She went to sort the last boxes in the garage, the ones shoved under the workbench, to see if there was anything in them worth a tag. Dusty cardboard boxes, taped shut years ago. She dragged one out into the light and slit the tape with her thumbnail and folded back the flaps. Papers, mostly. Old receipts. a manual for a machine long gone. And magazines, a stack of old magazines gone soft and curled with the damp, and she almost carried the whole box straight out to the burn barrel, because who wanted a dead man's 20-year-old magazines? But the top one had slid half out, and a face on it caught her eye, and she stopped. It was Ray. Young Ray. Ray at maybe 30, before her, or right at the edge of her, she couldn't tell the year at a glance. But it was him, unmistakable, that same steady face, only grinning, actually grinning, wide and open, in a way she'd rarely seen him grin in 41 years of marriage. He was leaning on a car, a long, low silver roadster, gleaming, brand new, the sun hard off its flanks. He had his shirt sleeves rolled, and his hands were black to the wrist with the honest grime she knew so well, and he was grinning at the camera like a man who had just done the thing he was put on earth to do. The magazine was called Custom Craft. She'd never heard of it. Across the top, in bold letters over the photograph, ran a headline. Nell got the first few words, "The Miracle From," and then a name she didn't know, and the rest curled away under a water stain, and she didn't finish it. She didn't finish it because she was looking at Ray's face, at that grin, at a version of her quiet husband she had never once met, a young man lit up like a lamp, standing beside a silver car in the sun. She looked from the photograph up to the tarp, to the long, low, dead shape under the dusty canvas, freckled with rust, sitting on 4 flat tires. They were the same car. Some slow, cold part of her understood that they were the same car, the same long nose, the same low line, but the front of her mind wouldn't hold it, wouldn't make it mean anything. The car in the picture was alive and silver, and famous enough for a magazine cover. The car under the tarp was $50 of junk that a man in a sport coat had laughed at. They couldn't be the same. Except she knew Ray's grin, and she knew that nose, and some cold, quiet part of her knew. She almost threw the magazine in the burn barrel anyway. Her hand actually moved toward it. It hurt too much, that grin, that young, happy stranger who was her husband. It hurt worse somehow than the funeral had. But she couldn't do it. She smoothed the cover flat with her palm instead, and she carried it out to the garage, and she set it on the cracked leather seat of the tarped car, face up, where the grinning young Ray could keep the old dead roadster company. Then she went back to her card table, because a customer wanted the mower after all, and would take 3. She'd have thought harder about the magazine, maybe, if she hadn't been so tired, and so far under, and so busy counting $60 against $2,760. But there was one more thing that morning she'd set aside without weighing, and it came back to her now as she stood in the thinning afternoon light. That morning, early, before the sale, she'd walked down to Detmer's for a coffee she couldn't afford, just to not be alone in the house. And the old men were at the counter, the diner crowd, Wendell Pruitt's crowd, hunched over their cups. And they'd gone a little quiet when she came in, the way people do around a fresh widow. But as she waited for her coffee, she'd heard one of them murmur to another, low, not meaning her to catch it. "The Larkspur man's stuff is going for nickels out on Cutler Street. Damn shame. The Larkspur man." She'd thought it was a joke, a little nickname, on account of the flowers along his garage wall. The ones he planted every spring for no reason he'd ever say. She'd even half smiled into her coffee, that they'd noticed, that they'd made him a fond little name out of his one foolishness. The Larkspur man. She'd carried it out the door thinking it was kindness, thinking it was a joke about flowers. It was near 5 and the light was going long and gold, and Nell was thinking about closing up the sale when a dusty Ford slowed on the county road out past the house. She noticed it because it slowed. Most cars went by the Cutler Street corner without a thought. This one, a dusty green Ford a few years old, out of county plates, caked with road, eased down as it came level with her yard, and rolled past slow, and then its brake lights came on, and it pulled over onto the gravel shoulder a little past the house and stopped. A man got out, gray-haired, heavyset, maybe her own age or a little younger, in a rumpled traveling suit with the tie pulled loose. He stood by his car a moment and looked at her sale, at the picked-over card tables, the for sale sign, the few last customers. A man who went to sales, she thought. You could tell. He had the look of a man who'd stopped at 100 of these across 100 miles. He came up the walk slow, in no hurry, tired from the road. But he didn't stop at the tables. He didn't lift a single dish or turn over a single lamp. His eyes went past all of it, past Nell at her cash box, straight down the yard to the open plank door of the garage, dark now against the gold evening light. And he walked toward it like something was pulling him. "Help you?" Nell called. He half turned, touched his hat brim, distracted. "Just. Mind if I look in your garage, ma'am?" "Nothing in there but an old car," she said. "It's for sale. It's tagged." He didn't seem to hear the last part. He'd already turned back to the garage, and he ducked in under the low door into the dark, and Nell, tired, let him go, and started counting the cash box for the day. She'd have gone on counting, except that the garage went very quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you look up. She looked up. The gray-haired man was standing over the tarped car. He had lifted the canvas, the whole front of it, folded back, and he was standing stock still, both hands frozen in the air above the fender, not touching it yet. Just held there over the metal, like a man about to lay hands on something he didn't dare believe was real. The gold light came in the doorway and lit the dust and lit the dull silver nose of the car and lit the side of the man's face, and his face had gone the way old Wendell Pruitt's had gone, gray, struck. And then, slowly, he lowered one hand and laid it flat on the rusted fender. And even from the card table, even across the whole length of the yard, in the last gold light of that October evening, Nell Bishop watched the stranger's hand come to rest on her husband's car. And that hand would not stop shaking. The hand kept shaking. Nell set down the cash box and came up the yard, slow, the way you approach a man at a graveside. He didn't hear her. He was looking at the car the way she'd once looked at Ray in his coffin, like the looking might undo it. "Mister," she said. "You all right?" He turned. His eyes were wet. A grown man, gray at the temples, standing in her garage with his hat still on and water in his eyes. "Ma'am," he said. His voice came out cracked. He cleared it. "Ma'am, where did you get this car?" "It was my husband's." She folded her hands over her apron. "It's for sale. $50. Same as it says on the tag." He looked at her a long moment. Then he looked back at the car, and something moved across his face that she couldn't name. He took his hat off, just took it clean off his head and held it against his chest, standing there in the dust, the way a man does in church or at a funeral, or when the flag goes by. $50, he said, very quiet, almost to himself. "Is that too much?" She said it plain. "You can look it over. Tires are flat, chrome's all gone to rust. It hasn't run in 20 years, I don't think. It's an old car, and it's in the way, and I need it gone before Friday." She heard her own voice run on and made it stop. The man said nothing. He set his hat on the workbench. Ray's workbench. The pegboard behind it with all the painted shadows where the tools used to hang, and he leaned in over the front of the car and put his face down close to the metal, close as a jeweler, and ran 2 fingers along the top edge of the fender. Behind them, at the gate, a car door slammed. "Now hold on. Hold on just a minute." Chick Lorwin. He'd been halfway to his own car with a lamp under each arm, and he'd seen the Ford and the out-of-county plates, and now here he came back up the drive with his salesman's walk, quick and loose. "Afternoon," Chick said to the stranger. "You a dealer?" The gray-haired man straightened up slow. "No. Because that heap there and them tools, I already got a deal working on those with the lady. 40 for the lot. Ain't that right, Mrs. Bishop?" He didn't look at her when he said it. He was reading the stranger's face and not getting anything off it. "So if you're thinking about that car, friend, I'd save you the trouble." It spoke for. Nell opened her mouth. But the stranger spoke first, and mild. "You offered $40, he said. "For the car and the tools both. That's generous, is what that is." Chick shifted the lamps in his arms. "You seen the state of it. Somebody's got to haul that thing off, and it ain't gonna haul itself. Man builds a pile like this, it becomes somebody else's problem when he's gone. No offense, ma'am." He smiled his easy smile. But that's the truth of it. The stranger looked at Chick for a while. Then he looked at Nell. "Ma'am," he said, "have you sold this car to this man?" "No," Nell said. "I have not." "Have you signed anything? Shook on anything?" "I have not sold Ray's car to anybody," Nell said, and her voice came out harder than she meant, and she saw Chick's smile tighten at the edges. "He offered $40 for the whole garage and called my husband a hoarder of scrap. I didn't take it. I won't." The stranger nodded once, slow, like she'd confirmed something. He turned back to the car. "Then I'd like to buy it," he said. "At your price." $50. Chick laughed. It came out too loud in the small garage. "You'll pay 50 for that when you could. Well, hell, buy it then, mister. No skin off me." But he didn't leave. He set the lamps down on the workbench, careful, next to the stranger's hat, and he stood there. Nell watched him watch the stranger, and she saw the first crack of doubt go across Chick Lorwin's face. He was a man who made his living reading other men, and he couldn't read this one. And it worried him. "I'll write it up," Nell said. She went to the card table for her tag book and her pen. And she came back, and she leaned on the fender of the car, her husband's car. The last thing of his in the world she still had to give away, and she wrote it out in her plain cook's hand. "One roadster, as is. Sold to." She looked up. "What's your name, mister?" "Reynolds," he said. "August Reynolds." "Gus," she wrote it. "August Reynolds. $50. And she signed it, Eleanor Bishop, and her hand shook writing her own name, the way it had shook every time she'd had to sign something these last 8 months, on the bank papers, on the funeral papers, her name gone thin and wandering where it used to be round and sure. Grief did that. Made your own signature a stranger's. She tore the slip out and held it across the fender to him. He didn't take it right away. He looked at it in her hand. And then he took it, careful, with 2 fingers, the way you'd take something out of a fire, and he folded it once and put it in his shirt pocket, over his heart, and he pressed his hand flat on the pocket a second like he was making sure it was still there. "I've got the keys," Nell said. "They were in his coat. In the closet. I found them when She stopped. "I'll fetch them." "Ma'am," Gus said, "before you do." She waited. "May I look under the hood?" "Look at whatever you like," Nell said. "It's yours now. $50. And she almost smiled. "You paid too much." Gus Reynolds went to the front of the car. There were 2 little chrome catches under the front lip of the hood, gone dull, and he worked them loose with his thumbs, and he lifted the long hood up and back on its hinge, and it groaned. 20 years of stillness in the sound. Chick Lorwin leaned in to see. So did Nell, though she didn't know why. She'd never once looked under this hood in her life. In 41 years she had never wondered what was in it. Gus went very still over the engine. For a while he didn't say anything at all. His eyes moved over it, part to part, the way you'd read a page. Then he reached in and laid his fingertips on something, a curve of metal, a run of pipe, and Nell heard him breathe out, long and shaky. "This isn't stock," he said. He wasn't talking to them, he was talking to himself, or to the car. "None of this is stock. Look at these headers. Look at," his hand moved. "These are brazed. By hand. Every joint. Nobody sold these. Nobody ever sold these. Somebody sat with a torch and made every one of these to fit this and nothing else." He looked up, and his face had gone white under the road dust. "You don't buy this. You can't buy this. A man makes this." "It's a motor," Chick said, but his voice had lost its ease. "It's an overhead conversion," Gus said, "on a flathead block." "Do you understand what that—" He stopped himself. He looked at Nell, and he seemed to remember she was a widow and not a mechanic, and he gentled it. "Ma'am, in 1953, there wasn't a company in this country selling what's sitting in this engine bay. A handful of men could even dream it. Fewer could build it. And the ones who could, you'd have heard their names." He stepped back around the side of the car. He was moving different now. Quick, and then careful, like a man who's afraid of what he'll find, and can't stop looking anyway. He ran his palm down the length of the body, along the door, over the swell of the rear fender. "This isn't steel," he said. "Course it's steel," said Chick. "Knock on it." Gus rapped it with a knuckle, twice, and the sound came back soft and dead, not the ring of steel. "It's aluminum. The whole body's aluminum. Hammered, over a wood frame, feel the flex. Right there, ash, I'd bet. Ash bucks under hand-formed panel. You see this seam?" He crouched. His finger traced a line down the flank of the car that Nell had never noticed, a faint ridge under the freckled rust. No press stamped that. No die. That's a man with a mallet and a sandbag and 10,000 hours. You could lay every panel off this car flat on a bench, and no two would be the same, and they'd all still be right. There isn't a machine on Earth in 1953 could make this. There's barely one now. Nell looked at the car. She had spent 41 years thinking of it as the low, ugly shape under the tarp that her husband disappeared behind on Sunday afternoons. His foolishness. The thing that ate the money that should have gone to a new Davenport, a trip somewhere, a life a little easier. She looked at it now and tried to see what the stranger saw, and couldn't. Quite, it was still just an old car to her eyes. But the stranger's hands were shaking again, worse now, and a man doesn't shake at an old car. "Wipe the front of it," Gus said suddenly. "The cowl. Right there, under the windshield." "May I? Do you have a rag?" Nell took the rag from her apron pocket, the one she'd been using all day to wipe the dust off things for the sale, and she handed it across. Gus took it, and he leaned over the front of the car, and he wiped, slow and gentle, a little patch of the cowl clean. And then he stopped wiping. And he stood there, bent over the car, and he didn't move. "Mister?" Nell said. He didn't answer. He was looking at the little clean patch he'd made. Nell leaned in to see. There, in the metal, stamped small and deep, where 20 years of dust had hidden it, a flower. A little 5-petaled flower cut into a die by somebody's hand, pressed into the aluminum, and under the flower 2 letters. R.B. A larkspur, stamped into the cowl of the car. And under it, Ray's initials. Nell put her hand to her mouth. Gus Reynolds set the rag down on the fender. He reached out and gripped the raised edge of the hood where it stood open, and he held on to it, and Nell understood he was holding on to it because his legs had gone unsure. His knuckles were white on the metal. His mouth worked. When the words came, they came broken. "The larkspur," he said. "That's," Nell started. "He planted them. Every spring. Along the wall out there. I never knew why. He'd never say why." "No, ma'am." Gus turned to her, and the tears were down his face now, right down into the gray of his stubble, and he wasn't ashamed of them. "The larkspur. That's what they called it. The car. That's its name. He laughed, a wet, broken sound. 22 years. 22 years I have been looking for this car. Since I was a young man. Every man I know in this business has looked for it. We thought it was gone. We thought it got cut up for scrap in '54. Everybody thought that. Because it won everything there was to win in '53, and then it just vanished off the face of the earth. The builder walked away and took it with him, and no one ever saw either of them again. Nobody knew his name. He never gave it. They just called him. Gus stopped. He looked at the workbench, at the pegboard with its painted shadows, at the coffee cans of bolts sorted by size, at the tackle box, at the whole quiet, ordered world of a man who'd kept his tools like a surgeon and never told a soul what he'd done with them. They called him the Larkspur Man, Gus said softly. That's all. The Larkspur Man. And Nell Bishop sat down. There was a stool by the workbench, and she sat down on it because the garage had gone strange around her. The Larkspur Man. She'd heard it that very morning at Detmer's, the old men murmuring over their eggs, the Larkspur Man's things are going for nickels, and she'd thought it was a joke about his flowers. A little unkindness about a queer old man who grew flowers by his garage. She'd near cried into her coffee thinking they were laughing at Ray. They hadn't been laughing at Ray. They'd been mourning him, in the only way old men know how. He never told me, Nell said. Her voice came out very small. 41 years. He never told me any of it. Ma'am. Gus came and crouched down in front of her, so his wet face was below hers, looking up. The way you'd talk to a child, or to somebody in shock. Ma'am, I can't take this car for $50. We had a deal, Chick Lorwin said. Both of them had forgotten he was there. He was standing on the other side of the car, and his face had gone a color Nell had never seen on him. A kind of sick yellow-white, and his eyes were going over that car now like a man doing sums he didn't want the answer to. You had a deal, Chick said again, louder, to Gus. $50. She wrote it. You put it in your pocket. I saw you. That's a done deal. That's binding. You can't turn around now, and I'm not turning around. Gus stood up. He faced Chick across the hood. I'm doing the opposite. I'm telling this woman she can't sell me this car for $50, or $500, or $5,000. Because it's worth more than that. It's worth more than that by a long way. He looked at Nell. Ma'am, I don't know how to say this so it lands soft, so I'll just say it. This car is worth more than your house. It's worth more than your house and every house on your street. I have watched one car off this man's circuit. A lesser car, a car nobody wrote a legend about. I watched it change hands 2 years ago, and I am not going to tell you that number standing in your garage because you'll think I've lost my mind. But it starts with a figure that would pay off whatever you owe the bank and never leave you wanting again. The garage was quiet. Out in the yard, somewhere, a neighbor woman laughed at something, far away, from another world. You're lying, Chick said. But he said it the way a man says it when he already knows he isn't. You're trying to run me off it so you can. I've got no reason to lie to her. Gus didn't even look at him. He kept his eyes on Nell. I could have taken that slip in my pocket and driven off, and been the luckiest thief who ever lived. $50 for the Larkspur. Men would have called me a genius, and I'd have known every day for the rest of my life that I stole a dead man's masterpiece off his widow while she was trying to save her house. I'd sooner not have found it at all. His voice went rough. Your husband didn't build junk, ma'am. Whatever that man told you it was, he tipped his head at Chick. Whatever anybody told you. Your husband built the one we've been looking for. The best one. He built it, and then he did the strangest thing a man ever did. He won everything there was, and he put it under a sheet, and he went and got a job at a plant and grew flowers, and he let the whole world go on thinking it was lost. For 20 years. I have to know why. Do you know why? No, Nell whispered. And then, there might be. She got up. She went to the car. She opened the passenger door, and it gave a long, complaining creak, and she leaned in across the cracked leather seat where the magazine still lay, the young, grinning Ray on the cover that she'd set there an hour ago, and she opened the glove box. It was stuffed with old things. Fuses, a stub of pencil, a road map soft as cloth, and a small flat notebook, black, the cover gone gray with handling. She brought it out into the light and opened it. Ray's handwriting, pages of it, small and neat, all numbers and words she didn't understand, timing figures, weights, notes to himself in the shorthand of a man talking to nobody but himself. She turned the pages and pressed flat between two of them, brown now and paper thin, a dried flower. A larkspur. Pressed and kept for 20 years. And on that page, in Ray's hand, under a date from the winter they married. Just a few lines. Nell read them once to herself. Then she read them out loud, because Gus was watching her face and it wasn't fair to make him wait. "Won everything there was," she read. Her voice held, barely. "Then I met her, and one more. Let the world keep looking." She closed the book. She stood in her dead husband's garage with the dried flower he'd kept and the words he'd never said to her face, and she understood, 41 years late, what the garage had been. Not his foolishness, not the money pit, not the queer habit she'd been glad he gave up. It had been the loud life he'd lived before her and set down for her, on purpose, without one word of complaint, so that she would never have to compete with it. He hadn't given up the cars because he had to. He'd given up the world because he'd wanted her more. And he'd never told her, because telling her would have made it a sacrifice, and he hadn't wanted her to carry that. He'd wanted it to just be a marriage. A plain, good 41-year marriage to a quiet man who grew flowers. She didn't cry. She'd run out of crying back in March, standing at his grave in the cold. But she put her hand flat on the roof of the car, the way Gus had, the way the gray man had before her. And she stood there a while. "He always kept his best where nobody would look," she said. "Word travels in a small town the way water finds the low ground, fast, and everywhere at once, and into every crack." By the next morning, Marne Falls knew a man from 2 states off had come through and near about fainted in Nell Bishop's garage, and by noon it knew the word he'd used, worth more than the whole street. And by supper there wasn't a soul at Detmer's diner talking about anything else. And by Wednesday Chick Lorwin had a lawyer. He came up the walk at 9 in the morning with the lawyer beside him, a soft young man in a brown suit carrying a briefcase, and Chick had got his color back and his smile with it, and Nell knew before he opened his mouth that the smile meant trouble. "Mrs. Bishop," he tipped his hat. "You remember we had an understanding. Saturday, $40. The car and the tools. In front of witnesses. 11 of your neighbors heard it." He said the number 11 like he'd been counting on it. "Now, I don't like to be hard about a thing like this, you being recently widowed and all. But a deal's a deal, and I'm within my rights, and Mr. Ostrander here will tell you the same." The soft young man said the car was subject to a prior verbal agreement, and it would be advisable for Mrs. Bishop to make no further disposition of the property until the matter was resolved, and that resolving it might take some weeks, possibly months. Weeks, possibly months. Nell stood in her doorway and felt the floor go out from under her, because it was Wednesday, and the last Friday in October was 2 days off, and she had $60-some from the sale, and $2,760 owed, and if the car was tied up in some lawyer's argument until Christmas, then there'd be no car and no house either, and Ray would go into the ground of the town's memory as a hoarder of scrap after all, and Chick Lorwin would own the arguing of it. "I never took your $40, Nell said. "It's your word against a garage full of witnesses, ma'am." Chick's smile widened. You want to spend what little you've got fighting me in a court? That's your business. Or you could be sensible. I'll tell you what, seeing how things have come out, I'll be more than fair. I'll give you $500 cash, today, for the car. 500, that's 10 times what you had it marked. That pays your bank and leaves you money over. And all this ugliness goes away. He spread his hands, the reasonable man. I'm trying to help you, Mrs. Bishop. $500. 2 days before she lost everything. It was the cruelest number he could have named, because it was real money, more money than she'd held at once in years. And it was sitting right there in his coat, and all she had to do was betray what she'd learned on Saturday and hand her husband's life to the man who'd called it scrap. Nell looked at him a long moment. No, she said. Mrs. Bishop, you listen to me, Chick Lorwin. She came out onto the step, and the young lawyer took a half step back, though she was only a gray-haired cook of 61 in a house dress. You stood in my garage Saturday, and you called my husband a man who liked hoarding scrap, and you said it loud, in front of my neighbors, to run my price down so you could carry off for $40 a thing you didn't have the eyes to know the worth of. That's the whole of you, right there. You never wanted that car. You wanted a widow you could work. And now that a man who does have the eyes has told you what you near about walked off with, you come back with a lawyer and $500 and a smile. She was not shouting. Her cook's voice, flat and level, that had run a school kitchen for 22 years and quieted rooms full of children. I would sooner lose the house. Now get off Ray's walk. Gus Reynolds hadn't gone home. He'd taken a room at the boarding house on 2nd Street, and he'd been on the telephone 2 days straight, and Thursday morning he brought them to her. They came in 3 cars. 2 of the men were old, older than Wendell Pruitt even, one of them with a cane, and one of them who had to be helped up the drive. And they had come from Ohio and Indiana overnight when Gus called them, because Gus had said one word on the telephone, Larkspur, and old men who'd thought they'd never hear that word again in this life had gotten in their cars in the dark. The third man was younger and wore glasses and carried a leather case and a magazine in a paper sleeve, and he was from Custom Craft. And he had come to authenticate, which was a long word for looking at a thing and saying under oath what it was. They opened the garage. And the town came. Nobody sent for the town. It just came, the way it had come to the yard sale, only more of it, the neighbors who'd browsed her tables and passed the car by, the Halloran sisters who'd bought 1 teacup for a nickel, Pete Mackey and his wife who'd carried off the Davenport for $8, the Tursky boy who'd called it a junk pile, standing now at the front of the crowd with his eyes wide. And the men from Detmer's, all of them, the whole diner counter emptied out and standing in Nell Bishop's yard with their hats in their hands. And Wendell Pruitt. They wheeled the tarp back, and the 2 old builders went to the car the way the faithful go to a relic. The one with the cane put his hand on the cowl, on the little stamped flower Gus had wiped clean. And he bent down close to it, and his lips moved, and then he straightened up and turned to the crowd, and his old voice cracked right down the middle. I ran against this car, he said. 1953. I had the fastest thing I ever built, and this car made it look like it was standing still, and then the fella that built it packed up and shook my hand, and I never saw him again in 21 years. He looked around the yard, at all the ordinary faces. You people lived next to him. You lived next to it. All this time. He shook his head slow. Lord above. All this time. The man from Custom Craft opened his leather case on the workbench. He had the 1954 issue in its paper sleeve, and he had the curled copy Nell had found and set on the seat, and he laid them side by side, and he took photographs, and he measured the seams with a little steel rule, and he found the serial the magazine had recorded stamped into the frame under the car exactly where the story said it would be. And he found the Larkspur. And he took his glasses off and rubbed his eyes and said, to Gus, but loud enough for all of them, "It's the car." There's no question. It's the car. And then he said the number. He said it quiet, and only to Nell and Gus, turned away from the crowd, but Nell heard it, and it was a number with a shape to it she'd never once put next to her own name. And it did not start with a 5, and it did not start with a 500, and it made the 2,760 she owed the bank look like the 50-cent tags she'd tied to the teacups. She didn't say anything. She just nodded, once, like a woman being told the weather. Chick Lorwin was at the back of the crowd. Nell saw him. He'd come to watch, maybe to make his claim again in front of everyone, and he stood there in his good coat while the old man cried over the car and the town went silent. And she watched the whole thing arrive on his face at once. What he'd stood in front of Saturday. What he'd called a heap. What his own loud mouth had told 11 witnesses he'd do them a favor to haul away. Nobody had to turn on him. Nobody had to say a word to him. The two old builders never looked at him. The town never looked at him. The reverence in that garage was for Ray Bishop, and it filled the whole space, and there was no room left in it for Chick Lorwin at all, and that was the worst thing that could have happened to a man like that. He turned and he went down the drive to his car alone, and his lawyer went after him. And nobody watched him go except Nell. There was no verbal deal. Gus had said it plain to the young lawyer on the telephone the day before. No handshake predates a signed bill of sale. And here is the signed bill of sale, dated Saturday, in the widow's hand, sold to August Reynolds. And here is August Reynolds saying he won't hold her to $50 because it's a robbery, so where exactly is Mr. Lorwin's $40 car? The lawyer had stopped calling by Thursday noon. There was nothing to argue. A man can't sue his way into a deal he was too blind to make. The banknote got paid on Friday. Gus drove her to Ferris County Savings and Loan himself and stood beside her at the counter, and against a documented value from the man from Custom Craft, the loan officer's whole manner changed, and the $2,760 in arrears was made current in a single afternoon, and Nell Bishop walked out of that bank at 3 in the afternoon on the last Friday in October, owning her house free and clear, and the car besides. She kept the car. Gus told her she could sell it and never think about money again as long as she lived, and she said she'd think on it, and she thought on it, and she kept it. Some things you don't sell twice. The diner was the last of it. She hadn't been back to Detmer's since the morning she'd heard them murmuring and thought they were laughing. But the following week she went in for her coffee like she always had, and she pushed open the door with its calendar of the covered bridge, and the whole counter of old men looked up. And they stood. Every one of them, the whole row of them, old men with bad knees and canes. They got up off their stools when Nell Bishop walked in, and they took off their hats, and not one of them said a word. Because there wasn't a word big enough, and they knew it. And Wendell Pruitt, 80 years old, who'd lifted the tarp corner at her yard sale and gone gray and walked off without speaking because he couldn't speak, Wendell Pruitt stood at the end of the counter with his hat over his heart, and when he could finally get it out, all he said was, "Ray Bishop." Like a title, like the name of a saint. Ray Bishop, and Nell said, "The Larkspur Man," and the counter came apart, half of them laughing and half of them crying, and she sat down at the counter with them and had her coffee, and that was the morning Marne Falls took Ray back. 6 months later there was a museum. It was down in the State's Automotive Museum, a low brick building with good light, and they gave the Larkspur its own floor space in the middle of a room, restored now, the aluminum brought back up to a soft silver shine, the tires new and black, the chrome the way it must have looked the day in 1953 it made a fast man's car look like it was standing still. There was a rope around it and a placard on a little stand, and the placard read, "Built by hand by Raymond Bishop, Marne Falls, Michigan, lost 1954, found 1974. Nell went down for the opening. She wore her good dress. And when the room was full of people, custom carmen and photographers and folks who'd driven a long way just to stand near it, she went in under the rope, which they let her do, the only one they let do it, and she laid a single fresh larkspur on the front fender of the car. Right on the cowl, over the little stamped flower with his initials under it. The way he'd laid them along the garage wall every spring of their marriage, for no reason he'd ever say. She didn't cry. She stood back, and she looked at it under the warm light, gleaming, with his name on the card where the whole world could read it at last. And she smiled. Because she knew the reason now. He'd been signing the car all along. Every spring. Right where she'd been walking past it for 41 years. Gus Reynolds became her friend. He came through Marne Falls 2-3 times a year after that, and he'd take her to Detmer's for pie, and it was over pie one afternoon that he finally told her the figure the estate had turned down, the true auction number. The one they'd said no to so the car could stay whole and go to the museum instead of into some rich man's private barn. He told her the number, and Nell ate her pie and said it was a great deal of money for a thing she used to call his foolishness, and Gus laughed until he had to set his fork down. Wendell Pruitt was at the counter that day, and someone, one of the younger men who hadn't been there for any of it, asked about the flipper, the one from Ferris City, whatever became of him. And Wendell Pruitt, 81 now, didn't even turn around from his coffee. "Oh, him," Wendell said. "He'd have done us a favor hauling it off," he said. And the counter laughed, once, quietly, and let it go, because a man like that is his own punishment, and there was no need to add to it. Nell kept the house free and clear to the end of her days. She kept the garage too, and she planted larkspurs along the wall of it every spring for the rest of her life, right where he'd planted them, and she never once told anybody why. She figured Ray had the right idea about that. Some things you keep where nobody's looking. They're worth more that way. Somewhere near you there's a garage nobody's opened since the man who kept it went quiet. A shed, a barn, a room at the top of the stairs. And under a sheet in it there's a shape that the family calls his foolishness. The thing he disappeared behind on Sunday afternoons. The thing nobody ever asked him about. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's everything. Tell me in the comments what you think is under the tarp, and the town you're watching from. I'd like to know how far the larkspur travels.